everyone, for this video I'm going to be looking at a video that Christina Hoff Sommers made for Prager University. First, a little background. Before she started working at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the Koch brothers' conservative think tanks, Sommers was a philosophy professor known for publishing articles where she'd clutch her proverbial pearls over high school students not being taught Western values in schools. In one of her articles, she writes about a student who believed that Nagasaki and a traffic accident were morally equivalent. This is obviously a ridiculous and indefensible stance to take, and absolutely nothing like another of Sommers' papers in which she argues that veterans' benefit should be cut on the grounds that a veteran receiving aid for non-service-related issues is morally equivalent to a 30-year-old still living in his parents' basement. Aside from the fact that that's a pretty repugnant stance to take, there are obviously practical issues since it's not always easy to differentiate whether an issue is service-related or not, especially when it comes to psychological problems like PTSD. This isn't really a problem for Sommers, though, as we see in her book One Nation Under Therapy, in which she makes fun of Vietnam veterans for having PTSD, something which she claims that World War II veterans did not have. And I tend to think that a lot of the beliefs that are espoused by the types of people I make fun of in these videos aren't earnestly held, but are more likely cynical ways to advance their own agendas. But with the veteran stuff, it's like, who is this supposed to appeal to? I think this is just something that Christina Hoff Sommers is sincerely passionate about. Anyway, these days, Sommers has turned her ire away from veterans and towards an even more heinous group of freeloaders. Feminists. I think that Sommers' shtick has been so effective because it has a coming-to-Jesus angle to it. Essentially, she used to be a feminist, but then they went too far. In this video, I'll be looking at how she debunks the concept of the gender pay gap.
Well, actually, it's the feminists, celebrities, and politicians spreading this wage gap myth who have the math problem. Here's why. The 77 cents on the dollar statistic is calculated by dividing the median earnings of all women working full-time by the median earnings of all men working full-time. In other words, if the average income of all men is, say, $40,000 a year, and the average annual income of all women is, say, $30,800, that would mean that women earn 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. 30,800 divided by 40,000 equals 0.77. But these calculations don't reveal a gender wage injustice.
So, I'm actually going to give Sommers credit here and say that she's correct. The talking point that women make 23 cents less for the same work is incorrect. If you control for other variables or look from one industry to another, that number changes. With that out of the way, I'd say that pretty much every other thing that she says in this video is wrong. Let's watch.
Because they don't take into account occupation, position, education, or hours worked per week. Even a study by the American Association of University Women, a feminist organization, shows that the actual wage gap shrinks to only 6.6 cents when you factor in different choices men and women make. And the key word here is choice.
So, yeah, already a lot wrong here. First of all, the AAUW doesn't say that the wage gap goes down to 6.6%, but rather that it's 7% 1 year after graduating college and 12% after 10 years. They then cite a different study that put the wage gap at 6% specifically in the field of medical researchers. Second, they found that while occupation is a factor, they also note that women entering male-dominated industries tends to reduce the average wage of that industry. Third, education uniformly increases everyone's earnings across the board, but does not get rid of the gender wage gap. So if you compare college-educated women with all men, the wage gap seems to have shrunk, but if you compare women to men with the same level of education, you find that the disparity between them remains the same, or in some cases goes up. Finally, an important variable that the AAUW found that Sommers leaves out is race, which, probably isn't a choice. Okay, let's keep going.
In 2009, the U.S. Department of Labor released a paper that examined more than 50 peer-reviewed studies and concluded that the off-cited 23-cent wage gap may be almost entirely the result of individual choices being made by both male and female workers.
Cool, so let's take a look at that study, which was conducted for the Department of Labor by the CONSAD Research Corporation. This time, Sommers is at least correct about what the study says, but there's still a lot that can be taken apart in its findings. CONSAD's study finds that by controlling for other variables, the wage gap goes down to between 4.8 and 7.1%. The specific variables that were the most important were occupations and industries in which they work and their human capital development, work experience, career interruptions, and motherhood, all of which CONSAD uncritically refers to as choices. First of all, one problem I have with the methodology CONSAD uses is that while they do draw from over 50 peer-reviewed studies, all of those studies look at how the wage gap is affected by controlling for a certain variable. This isn't wrong by any means, and in fact can help us learn a lot, but it's not the only way of studying the wage gap. CONSAD never looks at any studies that seek to directly measure prejudice by using gender as the independent variable. There are a bunch of studies, for example, that have done this by sending out a bunch of resumes that are identical except half have male names and half have female names on them, all of which found that the male resumes were better received and were offered higher starting salaries, and none of these made it into CONSAD's report. Anyway, let's go through that list of choices. First of all, I think it's especially ironic that they call motherhood a choice, considering how many videos PragerU makes where they argue that abortion is murder. Career interruptions are also related to motherhood since they're often due to pregnancy and childcare, but also things like domestic work and taking care of elderly family members. And this, in turn, explains work experience, which CONSAD calculates by summing the amount of hours worked over 13 years. While it's become increasingly common for men to take on more domestic duties, women are still tasked with the majority of household and parental labor. This is generally referred to as the second shift, and unsurprisingly, something that CONSAD does not consider relevant to their data. At this point, I can already hear the angry keyboards.
Actually, having a family is a choice.
So, first of all, as I already noted, having a family is not always a choice if you don't have access to things like birth control, abortion, or sex ed. But even without that, while this should be pretty fucking obvious, socialization into ascribed gender roles is a fucking thing. Boys and girls are taught from a young age that certain behaviors and activities correspond to a certain gender, and those lessons stick throughout our lives. I'll cite some scholarly sources confirming as much in the description for anyone who's in the mood for homework.
But biology?
Okay, sure, it's not unreasonable to say that biology has an effect on how different genders behave. That said, it's far from a given that evolutionary biology has full or even the majority of control over our actions. I also love the way that Sommers offhandedly dismisses this issue.
I mean, what does it even mean to say that you were forced into your role? I mean, I taught philosophy for many years. And I can tell you right now that this is basically the question of free will and determinism. There is no resolution in sight. Philosophers have been debating free will for 2,000 years. I mean, how do I know any of you are major choices for you?
Yeah, I don't think we have to settle the free will debate to say that socialization affects our actions. Also, that doesn't even make sense. Isn't biological determinism equally, if not more so, fatalistic than social determinism? In fact, if biology has that much control over us, wouldn't that also mean that motherhood isn't actually a
choice?
But hey, let's put all of that aside and assume that having kids or taking care of your family is a choice. That's still a choice that women have to make, but men don't. As for occupation and human capital, i.e. skills you acquire to make your labor more valuable, I'll let Christina take it away.
Individual choices being made by both male and female workers. Well, let's look at some of those choices. Georgetown University compiled a list of the 5 best-paying college majors and the percentage of men and women majoring in those fields. Number 1 best-paying major, petroleum engineering, 87% male. Number 2, pharmaceutical sciences, 48% male. 3, mathematics and computer science, 67% male. 4, aerospace engineering, 88% male. 5, chemical engineering, 72% male. Notice that women outrepresent men in only one of the 5 top-paying majors, by only a few percentage points. Now consider the same study's list of the 5 worst-paying college majors. Number 1, counseling and psychology, 74% female. 2, Early childhood education, 97% female. 3. Theology and religious vocations, 66% male. 4. Human services and community organization, 81% female. And 5. Social work, 88% female. Here, it's the women who lead in all but one category.
So, the thing that's funny about all the low-paying professions Sommers listed there is that they're all extremely important fields that provide services that benefit society as a whole. But Sommers doesn't think it's important to question why early childhood educators, for example, are so criminally underpaid. It's just taken for granted that any field that's traditionally considered women's work, regardless of the good it may contribute to society, is valued less. This actually relates back to another point she made earlier in the video.
If for the same work women only make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, why don't businesses hire only women? Wages are the biggest expense for most businesses, so hiring only women would reduce costs by nearly a quarter, and that would go right to the bottom line. Don't businesses want to be profitable? Or are they really just bad at math?
So, one response to that, and this is going to sound crazy here, is that people act on illogical biases not accounted for in the rational choice theory of economics. The other point is that if you actually look at jobs that are predominantly female, they absolutely do pay less.
Even within the same profession, men and women make different career choices that impact how much money they make. Take nursing, where male nurses, on the whole, earn 18% more than female nurses. The reason? Male nurses gravitate to the best-paying nursing specialties, they work longer hours, and disproportionately find jobs in cities with the highest compensation. Now here's how one expert on nursing compensation, Professor Linda Aiken of the University of Pennsylvania, sums up the data. Career choices and educational differences explain most, if not all, the gender gap in nursing.
Okay, so let's see what else Linda Aiken has to say about that. In an interview, she said, if the observed gender gap in nurses' income is a product of female nurses being more likely to elect specialties that are in great need like primary care, long-term care, home care, and public health, it would not be in the public's interest to encourage more women to follow in the footsteps of men to elect higher-paying specialties or practice settings. Again, these predominantly female jobs are extremely important, and I don't think anyone, even Christina Hoff Sommers, thinks we should have fewer people in those fields, just that they shouldn't be paid as much as male-dominated industries. This relates back to the stuff about veterans. Christina Hoff Sommers is in no way anti-war. However, once these soldiers have outlived their usefulness, she regards them as nothing more than freeloaders. We're almost done here, but Sommers has a couple more explanations to run off, so here we go.
Few wage gap studies control for variables such as dangerous work environment. Men are vastly overrepresented, for example, on oil rigs.
So it's true that things like dangerous work are pretty hard to quantitatively study, but there might be some qualitative reasons women don't want to work on oil rigs other than it's hard. Maybe something like that time 2 women working on an oil rig found a hidden camera planted in their rooms to record them changing, and then the management did nothing about that. That might have something to do with it, right?
And here's another variable. Men are more willing and able to work long hours without advance notice. According to Harvard economist Claudia Golden, even if 2 lawyers have the same education, same specialty, and work the same number of hours, firms pay more to someone who is willing to always be on call and ready to be in the office when the firm needs them, as opposed to wanting a more regular schedule. This isn't sexism, it's just common sense.
Okay, so again, we're uncritically taking for granted that women need flexible hours so they can take care of their families while men aren't expected to do that, something that Harvard economist Claudia Golden herself said is part of the problem in her Freakonomics interview. It's also worth noting that being willing to work longer, more rigid hours has actually been found not to yield better work, but, that's the problem with common sense, I guess. So yeah, that was that. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Big thanks to Thought Slime for lending me his beautiful voice for parts of this video. If for some reason you follow me and not him, you should absolutely check his channel out. It's very, very good. There will be a link to that in the description. And yeah, thanks so much. Be sure to like and subscribe and comment, or whatever YouTube channels are supposed to say. Can you tell that this was the part I didn't write? So yeah, cool. Thanks so much, everyone. Peace.